Hello and welcome to CX Today. My name is Charlie, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Rob Kurver, the founding partner of the CPaaS Acceleration Alliance. Rob, thanks very much for joining me. How are you doing today?
Great to be here, Charlie. Thanks for having me. It's a great day. The sun started shining 2 minutes ago. It'll probably rain again in another 5 minutes. The weather's crazy, but it's good to be here.
Yeah, there's nothing. It's quite a different summer for us in Europe this year than the heat
It's
waves that
crazy.
we've had in
It's
recent
crazy.
years. Yeah, absolutely, man. But anyway, let's dive right in to the reason why we're here, and that is the Magic Quadrant, the CPaaS
Yes.
Magic Quadrant. And I'll start by displaying the 2024 matrix on the screen now for our viewers. And as you can see in the top right hand corner, we have Gartner's market leaders. In the top left hand corner, we have the challengers. In the bottom right corner, are featured the visionaries. And in the bottom left hand corner, that showcases the niche players. So Gartner has positioned these vendors on the matrix based on an assessment of their ability to execute and their completeness of vision. And that follows a thorough evaluation process, as I say. And now this is the second ever edition of the CPaaS Magic Quadrant. And I'll quickly also now put up a comparison with last year's inaugural edition on the screen now. And as you can see, not all that much has changed. MessageBird has dropped out. Twilio may have perhaps extended its lead, and Tata has dropped into the niche player category despite its acquisition of Kalera, which I think is interesting too. But Rob, obviously you're the expert in the CPaaS space, so I'll pass over to you, and I don't know if you can share maybe some of your top takeaways from this year's study.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. Yeah, it's an interesting quadrant. It's not surprising, I would say, especially the leader quadrant. Three of the four there are members of our alliance, and I totally agree that they should be in that quadrant. Vonage a little bit higher on the visionary scale because of the network API thing, right after the Ericsson acquisition. That's makes sense. Infobip following very quickly there. Twilio high on the execution. I'm not sure whether the assessment was made before, during, or after Jeff Lawson's leaving. So Twilio, I think it's a little bit. It's interesting to see how that develops over the next couple of quarters. But these are the big guys, and then the Cinch makes perfect sense. Um, so the other thing that sort of strikes me when I look at this is there's so many CPaaS players, so many CPaaS providers not on the quadrant, of
Yeah.
course. And then the big question is always, what do you need to do or to be included here? And especially if you think of CPaaS as more than a single solution, right? It's a suite of programmable communication capabilities. So depending on what somebody's looking for, you would be looking for different providers or solutions that are out there. And also there's a strong regional aspect with CPaaS. So there's many providers missing. I don't disagree with anything I see on the quadrant. So it's good that they do it.
Mm. Yeah, and I think there was a couple of really interesting points that you made there. One in terms of kind of which is best for maybe certain region or vertical. That's not necessarily obvious when you first look at the quadrant, and also the missing players because, as you said, there's kind of hundreds of vendors within this space, and those are points that I do want to kind of double down on later in this video. But for now, I don't know what strikes me as well when I first saw this is I was surprised by maybe perhaps the lack of movement given all the disruption that's currently happening within the CPaaS space. Did that perhaps surprise you at all?
No, that doesn't surprise me too much because I think we're in transition in the CPaaS space, right? For a long time. According to some people, CPaaS is messaging and messaging is CPaaS, right? And I think that's a bit naive. Certainly, it used to start with CPaaS 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, the likes of Twilio back then and Nexmo and some others. Sinch, Mblocks back then certainly was focused much on the messaging space. I think we're moving into, or have already entered a new era for CPaaS, where we're sort of post messaging peak. There's issues with messaging, right? SMS, A2P messaging has some serious issues with price, security, trust, artificial traffic, all of these things. So you see that the buyers or the users of A2P messaging are looking for new solutions. So going to rich messaging for branding purposes, looking at flash calling or some of the network API stuff for the authentication to replace OTP. So there's movement there, but we're going into a phase of innovation, I think. And that's also why um, it's so difficult when you're a buyer and when you're a user to sort of figure out what the safe bet is. And it really depends on the use case and the region and the vertical. So that's the approach that we always have in the CPaaS Acceleration Alliance, right? We don't start from the technology point of view, but we start from the use case point of view. We just released, for example, our service provider playbook, which has 93 use cases of CPaaS. And some are messaging, right? And some are rich messaging. But I would say the other 75% or so are related to AI, network APIs, all sort of also programmable or flexible contact centers. Because the way we look at CPaaS is it's really programmable or API based communication platforms. And then there's so much more. But then you don't want to do a magic quadrant with 200 participants, right? So you got to sort of draw the line somewhere. So in this particular view, I think it makes a lot of sense. But there's so much more out there that's hard to capture in a quadrant or a radar or any of the tools that traditionally used to make a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely, and I do agree with that. And I think it's interesting to your point on the change within the market in terms of the big predominant use case was kind of the A2P SMS messaging, and now that's changing and what that means for CPaaS players and their visions for the future. And I think some CPaaS players have been particularly visionary. You mentioned Vonage with its 5G APIs earlier. Given the strength of some of the visions, are you maybe surprised that some of the vendors within the Magic Quadrant didn't perform better?
I'm a little bit surprised that CM, the
Mm,
Dutch player, isn't on the quadrant.
yeah.
Because they have, I think, a really interesting take on CPaaS. They have the messaging, they do a bunch of other things. They have the payments. They have really chosen a specific niche where they I think outperform a lot of the other players. I think they're pretty global, so they must have sort of failed to meet one of the criteria somewhere. Maybe it's the email support. I'm not sure. Maybe not global enough. Um, and then there's an interesting area, of course, on video, right? It's mentioned, I think, in the quadrant that video is not a requirement to be on here. And I guess if it would have been, then maybe Twilio would have dropped out, right? Because they recently announced that they're going to stop the video part. I think video is a really interesting part of CPaaS that we see growing quite rapidly. And then, of course, the other part of CPaaS that you cannot ignore is anything to do with AI, Gen AI, image generation, all that stuff, which is, I think, going to that may change the quadrant next year or the next years for sure, because no nobody knows what's going to really happen there, of course.
Mm. Yeah, and I think yeah, again, really lots of really interesting points there. And, in the customer experience space, kind of in the broader customer experience space, there's an increasing focus on composability within customer journeys and blending different modalities and kind of AIs based on the kind of customer's intent, really. And CPaaS plays a huge role there. It's particularly in kind of videos are great for certain applications, AI through image recognition, kind of other examples that you gave. These seem to be the next kind of frontier for a lot of customer experiences. So yeah, that is surprising. Yeah, I do think that's interesting. And obviously, you mentioned there that CM, you were surprised that CM, maybe, well, you thought they could have been included too. And I noticed that MessageBird dropped out. dropped out too, which was a surprise. But I know there's been lots going on at that company over the past 12 months that we may not get into. Do you think there's maybe anybody else that was unlucky not to be included within the quadrant?
There's dozens of companies that
Mm,
were maybe unlucky not to be included. I think that's one of the problems with the quadrant, right? You sort of
yeah.
take the top 10 or 15. So I just spoke last week to the largest CPaaS provider in India,
Mm,
which I'd never heard of before, but they service I don't know, a billion customers over there. So you also and also this week I talked to the largest CPaaS provider in Nigeria and some of the other African countries. So I think one of the and that's one of the challenges doing the Magic Quadrant. This seems to be a little bit focused on maybe North America, Europe, maybe LATAM, like our space, if you will. If you go to the APAC region and countries like India, there's a whole different world. Middle East, Africa, same thing. So there's regional players that are not on the Magic Quadrant, but would be for potential buyers in those regions
mm,
a top three choice instead of a Twilio, which is the market leader in the US, but really less present in different parts of the world.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point, and it also makes me think about how buyers, CPaaS buyers, should leverage this study. I mean, should it be taken with a pinch of salt based on your location, or if you're in North America, maybe should this be kind of like your go-to guide for the space? I don't know what kind of advice would you give to a buyer in when they're sort of looking over the Magic Quadrant for CPaaS.
Well, I think it's a starting point, but
Mm,
definitely look at the other players and the smaller players in your region, in your vertical, and start with the use case, right? What are you trying to get done? What are you trying to solve? Um, what sort of provider are you looking for? Do you want to go with one of the big guys because maybe they're, I don't know, stable or they can help you, or do you want to go with some with a smaller, more innovative player? You could also say that, I mean, there's another category that's completely missing from the Magic Quadrant, sort of by definition of this being the Magic Quadrant, right? That's the local telcos. What
yeah,
we're seeing now is more and more operators, MNOs, telcos are getting into the CPaaS space, and they're doing their own services, oftentimes for messaging, right? So you can go there if you're looking for a trusted solution in a certain country. They're also looking at or working with some of these providers also on the Magic Quadrant. For example, Infobip and Vonage are really big on working with the operators to help them with a CPaaS proposition, and then also include the network APIs, which is the big thing from GSMA these days, right? Open Gateway Initiative, Project Camara. 70% or so of the operators worldwide have committed to opening their networks, and especially the 5G networks, through APIs to offer new capabilities related to network, like quality on demand, or location, or authentication, or your customer. These sorts of APIs are becoming important, and what we're seeing, and that's why I think it makes sense that Infobip and Vonage are a little bit more to the right on the visionary scale, right? Because they're big, and especially Vonage with the Ericsson acquisition, of course, they're really big on the collaboration with operators, with mobile, with MNOs, with carriers, also with wholesale carriers, to to work on CPaaS plus network APIs. And I think that's also where CPaaS is heading to in the next couple of years. It's going to be more complicated with more features, more a different category of API, but really important for future use cases and for the operators, of course, crucial to monetize their 5G investments.
mm. Yeah, and as you say, it's a big trend. Obviously, most people will think of Ericsson and Vonage, but Infobip had that big deal with Nokia. I think maybe last month, maybe two
Yeah,
months ago. That's the big news about was it Proximus bought Route Mobile. I think it was. And there's lots of stories like that. I mean, those are the headline stories. There's lots of kind
yeah,
of smaller deals like
absolutely.
that going on in the space, and that's going to be fascinating to watch too. And what that tells us about the future of this space, I think, will be particularly interesting. But I mean, we could talk about this all day, Rob, but I think that's maybe a great place to end today's discussion. But I think it's been very insightful, so thanks very much for joining me today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Charlie. And if people want to learn more about what's happening, we have an event in September in Amsterdam. Maybe you can share the URL somewhere. That's going to be a great 3-day event where we talk about the evolution of CPaaS and we touch on all these things that we just talked about.
Absolutely, yeah. I'll put a link into the description box for everybody who wants to check that one out too. But yeah, thanks again, Rob, and also thanks to everybody for watching. Bye for now.
Thanks.